just fast forward to where I was already homeless on the street, but here we are. And then local news media started, going to the rehab looking for me, knocking on my parents' door looking for me, et cetera. And I finally hooked up with Cron 4 and then NBC Bay Area and then ABC and then CNN came and I did a thing with CNN. And then I just decided after that, well, I'm going to just keep tweeting.
The whole harm reduction, what do you mean by harm reduction? I'm a huge critic, very big, adamant critic of harm reduction as a policy in California.
Yeah.
And I think that's, to me, even talking about that's beating a dead horse because the data shows that that's a failed policy. Right. What are the incentives of policymakers? By definition, the game that policymakers are playing, the ones that we're choosing to put as policymakers, are the ones that they have to get elected and they have to stay elected. All right. Welcome. It's good to have you back.
Nice to be back to
the INNOVAT Podcast, where we talk about the intersection of innovation and social impact, which is where I believe is the next exciting field for innovation. So, previous episodes, you shared your story, which was awesome, inspiring. You've got a lot of experience. So we wanted to talk about policy today.
Yeah. It's funny because I told my story and we kind of touched a little bit on policy, but it'll be good to do a deep dive into drug policy, homeless policy, housing policy, all the things which I found in my advocacy as my advocacy has evolved, are really driving a lot of this crisis.
So you're a unique story, a unique person. For those who didn't watch it, you were, successful middle class San Franciscan.
Yeah.
Then went on a 4-year assignment of crash and burn.
Opioids and heroin and fentanyl and homelessness. Yeah.
Ended up on the Tenderloin.
Yep.
And then in prison, jail. And then it's Salvation Army.
That's right. 6 months of rehab. And I found recovery. And next month, on the 24th of June, I'll have 7 years clean and sober.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So why don't you recap how you got launched into advocacy? Because that's a story in itself of a bad policy that you were the recipient of a bad policy and were able to change.
Yeah. I mean, so I'll just fast forward to where I was already homeless on the street. So in January 2018, I'm homeless on the streets. My wife had kicked me out of the house. She put a restraining order on me. I had nowhere to go, and I wanted to be close to my drugs. And there's organized drug dealing on the street, so I started hanging out on Golden Gate and Hyde in the Tenderloin, where I could get my drugs, and I lived out there for 6 months. And I started getting arrested out there because I was doing things to support my addiction that broke the law, like shoplifting, holding drugs for the dealers, drug possession, those types of things. And I kept going to jail, and I would be in jail for a day or two, and then they would let me go back into homelessness every single time until the 6th time, where I had committed too many crimes. I had too many charges too close together. And I spent 3 months in county jail where I was able to get sober. I wasn't in recovery from addiction, but I was sober at least and was able to make some better decisions. And got offered a choice of continuing to stay in jail, go back to homelessness, or go to rehab. And I opted to go to rehab, and that's kind of what changed my life. But it took 6 times for me to be.
So they give you 3 choices: stay in jail.
Yeah, stay in jail.
Go back to homelessness.
Or be released, right? And I had nowhere to go, so I would be homeless.
Or go to a faith-based recovery
facility.
Yeah.
Inpatient, residential, where I could live.
Sober.
6 months.
And you had to be sober.
I had to be clean and sober the whole time, and I got drug tested and all that stuff. And I opted for the clean and sober rehab because I didn't want to go back to the street, and I definitely didn't.
People put in that position, how many choose the clean and sober?
More than so. If they're offered the option of being released, just to be free, most people will take that because at least they're free, right? But for people that are motivated, that actually want to change or transform their life, or actually just give recovery a chance, they will opt for treatment.
So if we offer them freedom or rehab, they generally choose just freedom. And
But if
that
we offer,
ends up going back into the same cycle because
That's
they're
right.
on the support system.
That's right.
But if we offer them more jail time or rehab, they
take the
choose,
rehab almost every time.
even if it's sober. And
When it was over, and look, we had people. I'll be honest, we had people in our rehab that were faking it to make it. They were just doing sick in rehab to beat their charges, and they could live without meth or heroin. They'd already cleaned out from it in jail, right? They could live with it without it for 6 months, and the day they get released and get their charges dropped, they're right back at it. But there's a subset of us, about 25% of us, that went through the program that actually found recovery. And many of us are still clean and sober today. And I say the 25% because that's the national average for completion rates in drug treatment. It's 25% nationally. 1 in 4 people that go to drug rehab complete drug rehab. The other 3 fail the first time, which is why you have to keep coming back to them and engaging people that are struggling with addiction to get them to re-engage with recovery and treatment.
yeah, I heard the term 7 times. It takes on average 7 times of like a serious attempt to rehab before it sticks.
Right.
That might have been with human trafficking though, which is a deep trauma. I mean, all addiction has a deep trauma issue. So
Well, addiction is of the mind. It's treatable, right? You can arrest your addiction, um, but sometimes it takes multiple attempts. And now with the drugs being even stronger and our policies being even more permissive, it's really in today's environment. Like if I were on the street today in San Francisco in 2025, under the current policies that have been in place the last 5 or 6 years or so, I don't know if I could get clean because I don't know if I would be being held accountable to the extent that I was held accountable in 2018. And it's kind of weird because back then the laws had already changed around Prop 47, et cetera. But it just seems like now there's even more of a decision that has been made in many cities that people that are on the street struggling with homelessness are just victims, and they're kind of being held to almost a different standard than everyone else when it comes to breaking the
it's
law.
like the weaponization of victimization.
Correct.
So if they have been victims, the way out of victimhood is responsibility.
That's right. Accountability. So, and I always say, and this is a thing, I'm not the only one who says it, but it's kind of become one of my trademarks, is that accountability is a cornerstone of recovery. And you ask anyone that's in recovery from addiction or alcoholism, they'll tell you one of the steps in recovery is that you have to kind of take an inventory, a moral inventory of all the things you did that hurt people and all the people that hurt you. And you try to work through those things. That's holding yourself accountable. And then you ask God to remove those things. And then you kind of have a freedom, right, from that. There's those shortcomings, right? So that's
That's
accountability.
part of the 12-step, right?
That's part of
It's
12
extremely
right.
helpful.
And not everybody does 12-step. Even other recovery programs, there's a certain degree of ownership and accountability that comes along. So why then, as a society, have we changed the laws to remove the accountability for people? Why is that? The answer to me is that, it's racist, systemic racism, which we can talk about. th- uh, we're criminalizing poverty. We're criminalizing homelessness. And there are shreds of truth in all of those things. I'm not going to say there's not. But at the end of the day, if you're homeless on the street, addicted to fentanyl or meth, and you are breaking into people's cars to steal their backpacks, or you are going to Walgreens and shoplifting, those are behaviors that are sometimes exhibited as a result of drug use and drug addiction. We're not holding you accountable for being a drug addict. We're holding you accountable for the negative behaviors that you exhibit as a result of your addiction. And so you have to parse those two things apart. And they haven't. They've been jumbled together into one thing. And so the whole social justice framework on this is that you're criminalizing the homeless. And that's not what we're doing. We're basically trying to hold people accountable that are committing crimes to support their addiction. And I think that look, I'm not saying that's going to work for everyone, but that's what worked for me. I finally got held accountable for the crime.
So there was also a policy at the time, right? A bad policy, I think would say. Somehow you got your mugshot up on Twitter, right?
Yeah, so that's how I became an advocate, right? So getting back to that. So when you get back in 2018, when you get arrested in the Tenderloin Police Department has their own Twitter page. They don't use it very much anymore, but it used to be really active back then. And when they would arrest people on the street in the Tenderloin, they'd post their mugshot on Twitter for all to see, drug dealers, people committing crimes, etc. And I made the list. My mugshot got posted on Twitter. Tom Wolf continues to be arrested on this block. This time he had a bag of drugs at his feet because I was holding drugs for the dealers. And after I went through rehab, I came out of rehab. I was clean and sober.
So it was after the 6 months out of
rehab.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Out
I'm
of
like
Salvation Army.
I'm like 8, 9 months sober because I did like 3 months in jail and 6 months in rehab. I had to get a job, you know? I got kids. I got to figure out where I'm going to live.
Was getting a job a condition of being released, or it's a 6-month program? Did they work at all on you getting a job while you're in Salvation Army, or?
So yeah, great question. So it was my lawyer was trying to plea bargain my charges down because I had multiple felony charges hanging over my head and multiple misdemeanors hanging over my head. And the district attorney wanted me to take a felony, right, for the drug possession. And I really didn't want that because that was going to be a huge barrier for the rest of my life in regards to employment, et cetera. So I was motivated at that point to do the right thing. I completed treatment. The Salvation Army helped me find a job. In fact, they got me a job. I ended up working at the Salvation Army in San Francisco. And I showed up to court every single time I had to go to court. And the last time I went to court, I showed up with a pay stub and in a suit and my certificate of completion from rehab. And they basically gave me a deal where I ended up just taking a misdemeanor and 3 years of probation.
Did you have legal help at all?
I did. I had a public defender.
Okay.
I had a public that was appointed to me. I was homeless. I couldn't afford one.
Okay.
I had no money. But to my point about advocacy, so my mugshot's up on Twitter. I'm looking for a job, and I'm like, wow, if you Google Tom Wolf San Francisco, the only thing that's going to come up is that mugshot, and no one's ever going to hire me. And so
you looked great in that mugshot.
oh man, that was rough. So I responded to that tweet saying, I'm now in recovery. I'm 8 months clean and sober. Thank you, Salvation Army and SFPD, for helping me turn my life around. And that tweet went viral.
That's all you said.
That's all I said. That's it. And I posted it, and it got reposted and went viral on Twitter, and it went viral on Reddit. And I didn't even know really anything much about Reddit back then, but it was like the 3rd most viewed Reddit post in the world that day.
Wow.
And so I don't know why. It was just fate. So I tell people that I'm kind of the accidental advocate. I wasn't intending to be doing what I'm doing now, although I love what I'm doing now. It's my passion.
Well, interesting, because you weren't intending to get addicted either.
No, I sure was. I never intended to be a drug addict. I never intended to be homeless. But here we are. And then the local news media started, going to the rehab looking for me, knocking on my parents' door looking for me, et cetera. And I finally hooked up with Cron 4 and then NBC Bay Area and then ABC and then CNN came and I did a thing with CNN. And then I just decided after that, well, I'm going to just keep tweeting. I'm going to start tweeting about my experience on the street. And so I just started telling people about this was what it was like when I was homeless on the street. These are the things that I witnessed on the street. This is the system that I went through, the criminal justice system that I went through as a result, and then that just kind of just snowballed into a larger advocacy where eventually I went from 14 followers to 1,000 followers to 4,000 followers to 10,000 followers. And now I have 31,000 followers on X. And I have a national platform now where I go around and I speak. I've been to Washington, D.C., and I've been to Denver and all up and down the West Coast and spoke at different.
How often are you in Denver?
Last time I was in Denver was a couple of years ago because they have a different mayor now.
Yeah.
Who's not as receptive to, let's put it this way, he's embraced a more harm reduction focused policy regarding its homeless crisis.
Yeah, I was thinking you need to get up to date. The harm reduction people in San Francisco are kind of making a shift.
Yeah, well,
like you're following San Francisco, but you don't know what San Francisco's doing.
And I warned him at the beginning as he was coming into office. I was like, man, dude, don't embrace, you're going to do this whole thing with the hotels for the homeless and the harm reduction policies and all that. it's going to spiral out of control, and you're going to find yourself 4 years later that you've spent $500 million and the problem in your city is 5 times worse. Well, we're 3 years into his mayoralship over in Denver, and they have the most. They peaked on overdoses last year. They've had homeless hotels that have had 1,000 calls to service, 911 calls inside their hotels, and they've spent $400 million, and the homeless problem is worse than ever.
Yeah, and they're kind of throwing Salvation Army under the bus for
Well,
it too.
and that could have been any nonprofit, not just the Salvation Army. Look, everybody, when you hire someone that has a criminal background, you take a chance, right? And this guy maybe wasn't vetted enough, or maybe, they were just giving him a chance. I mean, look at organizations like Urban Alchemy in San Francisco, not just San Francisco, but that's all they hire are people coming out of prison,
Yeah.
right? And, I've seen some of them, allegedly selling drugs. I've seen a lot of them on the street using drugs while they're employed on the clock. So there are still challenges for those folks. And this is kind of the same thing that happened unfortunately, in the Salvation Army in Denver. And it happens. And the best thing you can do is just try to, you make amends and try to move forward and try to help people. And they're having a hard time over there because the Salvation Army agreed to take contracts, I guess, with these low barrier shelters, and that low barrier shelters is the only way the state of Colorado will give you money, and that means drug use is allowed. And so that's the same thing in California too, where it's like, if you want to fund housing for the homeless, if you want to fund drug rehab, it has to be under the harm reduction umbrella. And if
But I don't like, I mean, the whole harm reduction. What do you mean by harm reduction? I'm a huge critic, very big, adamant critic of harm reduction as a policy in California.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's, to me, even talking about that's beating a dead horse because the data shows that that's a failed policy.
harm reduction has been radicalized in California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado. It's been radicalized. I want to stress that. And I really hope at the federal level changes come where they can take the pieces of harm reduction that are valuable tools like Narcan distribution and in some cases clean needle exchange, and utilize that and basically ditch the ideas of safe injection sites and safe supply like they're doing in Canada. And this kind of radicalized approach of where if somebody's in rehab and they start using again in rehab, they don't remove them from the rehab. They leave them in the rehab around a bunch of people that are trying to stay away from the drugs. That's what's happening in San.
Yeah, and it's all how you frame it. Like what bothers me is we cite the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah.
And then we call it harm reduction. But it doesn't take even that deep of analysis to realize that we're doing something entirely different than what they're doing.
Yeah.
And why don't we call it, I mean, I think a better description of what the Scandinavian countries did is one, zero tolerance. They decided as a society, we're not going to have homelessness. Okay. Then two, an integrated system. So when you're talking about, we started about you making the choice between, 3 options and you chose rehab. They have mandated rehab and the systems are talking to each other. We have such a disintegrated system.
Right. And we have, first of all, we have actual like literal computer systems set up that don't talk to each other, right? You have one system that public health uses, one system that the Department of Homelessness uses. Only certain people can access bits of information because of HIPAA laws. Law enforcement doesn't get any access to it at all. So then you have these different departments working in silos, right? Where they're not talking to each other. If we had one uniform data collection point, right, that could be shared amongst several city, county, regional, or state agencies, it'd be a lot easier for us to track outcomes for people and track. And I think that's what Edge and Node is trying to do, what you guys are trying to do. The problem,
Yeah, that's
that is
the vision of the geo browser. They even looked at implementing a system of elbow prints because elbow is like a fingerprint, but there's no database for elbow prints. So you have some of the world's best and brightest that are looking at Web3 solutions to have anonymity and shared data. And yeah, I'm rooting for them. People smarter than me in that area
yeah.
are working on that. That's one of the things that's hopeful for me.
Now, and back to the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands is a great example, right? I like to use them as an example because everyone tries to talk about Portugal and the way they decriminalize drugs.
Well, I love talking about Portugal. My wife's Portuguese. That's another thing that really gets my ire because you're citing Portugal. Well, if you're going to cite them, actually do enough homework to see what they actually did and actually imitate them.
Right.
Don't just leverage them for your dogma.
Right. And so Portugal did decriminalize drugs in 2000 or 2001.
No, they decriminalized drug use.
Right.
They never made drug dealing legal.
Right.
It's a big difference.
So we have to be specific, right? So you're right about that. Also, culturally in Portugal, they frown on drug use. In the United States, we've been celebrating drug use in this country since the 1960s, right? And it was weed and LSD back then, but even in the 80s, like, how many songs were about cocaine, in the TV shows,
Yeah, we've worked. Yes. So my wife's Portuguese.
Right.
I started my career as a social entrepreneur in Portugal. I was playing basketball for a professional club there, and I was working with ministries on the street. Like Teen Challenge did an incredible amount of work. They're an amazing organization. They're very strong in Portugal, and others were doing amazing work. And that was in the early mid-90s when this heroin epidemic's at its height, and it was just zombie land.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it's really apples and oranges because of the cultural differences just in Europe in general than the United States around drugs. And also fentanyl hasn't hit the shores of Europe yet. There's very little illicit fentanyl there compared to here. Let's put it that way, right? We're talking about heroin over there. But, I just want to point out one thing about Portugal is that, look, they decriminalized the possession of drugs, but they cite you and you have to go to an administrative court where they encourage you to access treatment. And it's not just a magistrate that's there, it's a social worker and sometimes your family
An
members.
integrated system.
An integrated system.
And one of the biggest things that they put out, there was never like the power of the social norms and, like the good part of shame, the social society never agreed that drug use is okay.
Right.
In fact, quite the opposite.
Right. But here in the United States, we have large, well-funded organizations that have national influence, like the Drug Policy Alliance, that are actually telling you that it's okay to use drugs, that you should feel empowered as a drug user so that you can use with dignity. They released a paper in 2019, I'll never forget it, called Rethinking the Drug Dealer, where the paper claimed that drug dealers were the first line of defense in harm reduction and they should not be punished, right? Because they're actually doing the service by building relationships with people that use drugs. See, that's nuts. And they have national influence in drug policy. That's the thing. Organizations like that, like people don't understand.
Okay, this is controversial. Who are they funded by?
The Soros Foundation provided them with a 10-year, $50 million grant, and then they just raise money on their own. But that's who they're funded by. So it is a far left-leaning organization. I don't want to make it political, but it is. Like, let's face it, homeless policy, drug policy, housing policy, they're all politicized. And they are funded by a far left-wing organization and people that want to see a full kind of deconstruction of the current model in which we practice drug policy in the United States. Their ultimate goal would be the legalization of drugs, which means that you could walk into, like right now you have marijuana dispensaries, you could walk into a fentanyl dispensary and get fentanyl patches to wear on your arm so that you could self-medicate, right? And they say, well, we need safe supply where a doctor can prescribe you Dilaudid or hydromorphone instead of your fentanyl in the hopes that it would reduce your fentanyl use. Well, studies coming out of Vancouver in Canada now show that it actually made things worse. It drove up visits to the emergency room, and people were selling their safe supply of drugs on the street for cash so they could buy fentanyl with it because fentanyl's stronger. So none of those things are the answer. And they all say, well, it's all part of this continuum to reduce harm, but it's not reducing harm, and the data doesn't back that up.
No, I recently had a conversation. In fact, it's one of the podcasts. We didn't talk about policy. A young friend of mine, He's doing great work. So I respect him. He's on the front lines, and he was very pro harm reduction and housing first. But it's, again, you have these ideals, and I agree with the ideals. I agree with the ideal that we should not stigmatize drug use, and we should, in the sense that it's a mental illness, in the same way I'm not going to stigmatize you if you break your leg, and I'm not going to say you suck, you broke your leg. I shouldn't stigmatize you if you have a weakness and you're addicted. But I don't want to leave you on the ground crippled forever.
Right.
And I agree with the ideal of celebrating every little victory. And so and helping a person, meeting them where they're at. So I agree with that ideal.
Yeah,
But our policy, see, this is a deeper issue. Like the thing that I'm really against is sectarianism and doctrinarianism.
ideology should be something that's over there, like a goal that you maybe strive to achieve. Instead, we've taken ideology under the guise of social justice and harm reduction, which is part of the social justice umbrella, and put it front and center right here, right in front of you, so that there's no room for practicality of application of policy.
And we're not transparent with the results. We have a
Definitely
correction loop that is so slow, so that the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And there's a very short period where the actual policy is in the right place. It swings too far one way or the other, and you have one group. The thing is that the incentives of policy. Here's what I think the core issue is: the incentives of policymakers are different than the incentives of people like yourself or people on frontline services. What I have found is when you go to the frontline services, the people that actually care about people and are working with them and their hands are dirty, we agree much more than we disagree.
Yeah, I would think that there's some truth in that, in that, you can't deny the human suffering that comes with addiction and homelessness. It's undeniable. What we disagree on is how best to help that individual ease their suffering. That's all. That's where we disagree. So the harm reductionist view is that we should give them tools and the support that they need so that to ease their suffering while they continue to suffer within their addiction. My goal is to say, we're going to do something to actually supplant that addiction. And
Yeah.
we're going to supplant that with recovery. And their argument is that, well, you can't force anyone to get clean and sober. And for lack of a better term, that's a bunch of bullshit. Of course.
That is, yeah, and we don't do that in any other area.
Right. We
We
don't.
don't force somebody. We don't go up to somebody who's in a car wreck, who's bleeding, and we don't say, they're unconscious or whatever. They can't make a decision. We don't say, I can't violate your HIPAA rights to actually get you in an ambulance. Like, of course not.
You can force anyone to stop using drugs. You just put them in a controlled environment and give them maybe medication or whatever to help them overcome the cravings, etc. And you can get them clean off of drugs. It's keeping them off of drugs that's the challenge. And that's where, again, like the blame goes to the wrong places, right? The harm reductionists, like there was a UCSF doctor a few weeks ago in the news, in the paper, said that abstinence-only treatment is deadly. This is an addiction medicine doctor at UCSF that said abstinence-only treatment is deadly. And I'm sitting here like, these are the people that we're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to. They're employed at a big hospital that are making decisions about people who are struggling with addiction, who've never been addicted before, never spent a day homeless on the street. Everything they learn in a book, right? And they're not.
They're manipulating the data, and
they won't come and talk
they're
to
on the
people.
take.
Yeah, well, they won't come and talk to people like me that have lived it.
Andrew Huberman, I was watching his program, watching to his podcast yesterday. He was talking about public health, and he was actually talking about food and high processed food and all the data that highly processed food is like so horrible for you, and high sugar content. And somebody from the American Heart Association just went on the record saying there's no connection, promoting high sugar food, saying we can't ban it at all. And it's like, these people that we trust, we've weaponized the whole, like, academic system,
Well,
and they write
again,
papers because that's they're funded.
again, it becomes ideological at that point. What's the ideology that they support? Well, these doctors support harm reduction. They support supervised or safe injection sites. They support decriminalization. So, of course, they're going to advocate for things like abstinence only treatment is deadly, which is completely ridiculous and unfair. And
When you're dealing with fentanyl too,
Yep.
which is a whole nother, I mean, each iteration of drugs has been a whole nother ballgame. They keep getting worse and worse. Where small difference in dose and you're dead.
Right.
Like, you can't get anything more deadly. And you have this massive number of people who are dying. What are the numbers nationwide of people who are dying of fentanyl?
Last year, 108,000 people died of drug overdose. About 90,000 of those were from fentanyl. This year, so far, the numbers are down about 10 or 12%. And it's funny because, again, the reasons why are being obfuscated, right? Some people are saying, well, it's because we did the naloxone distribution and we've done all these harm reduction measures that's helped reduce overdose deaths. That's one reason, but that's not the only reason. How about the low-hanging fruit, the most vulnerable that we're already using, died? How about
I
that,
know, that's
right?
heartbreaking.
That's another reason why. How about we have worked to crack down on fentanyl trafficking even prior to Trump, during the Biden administration, where they seized over 20 metric tons of illicit fentanyl at the southern border last year. That probably had an impact too. So it's not any one thing, and it's really unfair how the media portrays it because, again, much of the media has, especially mainstream media, has lost their objectivity. So they want to support a specific narrative.
Are you familiar with system design theory? Okay, every system is ideally designed, whether it's evolved or was intentionally designed, to produce exactly the result it's producing.
That's messed up if that's the case.
Well, that's just a statement of fact.
Right.
It's just true. And it's understanding, looking at, systems is looking at not just one policy, but the whole system.
Right.
This actually gives me a lot of hope because we have to realize we all have to take responsibility for it.
We do.
And we have to zoom out, but looking at incentives like, okay, follow the money. Who's funding who? Okay.
Right.
What are the incentives of policymakers? By definition, the game that policymakers are playing, the ones that we're choosing to put as policymakers, are the ones that they have to get elected and they have to stay elected. We have a system that incentivizes polarity, dogma, and also our system, particularly in San Francisco, allows for extreme views. It incentivizes extreme views.
Right.
The media also.
Right.
So it's easy to get elected by extreme views.
It is.
Okay. And then the media also, what is the business they're in? Clicks, attention. And so, they don't choose the best policymakers as their experts. They're choosing the people that can get the most hits. And it's all extremism, polarization.
Mhm. Except it's all one-sided here in San Francisco. There's no balancing act here. Like Daniel Lurie is probably the most moderate mayor we've had. It is the most moderate mayor we've had since Willie Brown, and he's probably even more moderate than Willie Brown was, and maybe Feinstein, where he's
So
pragmatic.
talk about his policies. We can do constructive criticism.
Well,
How's he actually doing? Just past 100 days, like maybe
Yeah.
120 days in office?
yeah, I give him very high marks on what he's doing. So I like Lurie. I've liked him from the beginning. First of all, he's a nice guy, right?
I'm not in San Francisco. I didn't vote for him because I can't vote for the San Francisco mayor, but he was, of the three front runners, he was my choice. I did endorse him.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, look, the problem with the previous mayor is that everything was very transactional with her, and it turns out that there was a lot of corruption that was happening under her watch. Not to say she was corrupt, but under her watch there was a lot of corruption that was uncovered. The head of DPW ended up in federal prison. The head of the Public Utilities Commission ended up in federal prison. These people were close personal friends of London Breed. So it's like there's challenges there too. The head of the Human Rights Commission got removed, Dr. Davis, after, the misappropriation of funds of like $25 million that went to the Human Rights Commission. So anyway, along comes this new guy that's just kind of simple, straightforward message. Public safety is my number one priority in San Francisco. He started talking to me and others in the recovery community early on when he was still running for mayor, like we're talking like a year ago or more, about um, what would be the best solutions moving forward. And I think what his goal is to integrate, have an integrated model to help people get off the street where you have kind of a blend of accountability, um, abstinence-based treatment, drug-free stuff, and harm reduction, all trying to kind of work together. Now, is it working out so far perfectly? Well, it's a bumpy road because look, they changed leadership at the Department of Public Health in San Francisco, which was a great move. Dr. Grant Colfax was a radical harm reductionist, period, right? They put in Dr. Tsai, who's more of he's like more pragmatic, more of a kind of a technocrat, and he's more open to the idea of promoting recovery, having more drug-free or clean and sober facilities as part of the overall continuum of care in San Francisco, which is a huge win. But everybody underneath him, like Dr. Hillary Kunins, who's the director of the doctor who runs behavioral health in San Francisco, she's a radical harm reductionist, right? She still works there. She's still making policy. She still controls a $700 million budget for behavioral health in San Francisco. Where do you think that money is going? How is that money being spent? Well, it's being spent on, you know, uh, more permissive harm reduction stuff and the continued push for um,
Yeah, see, we need transparency and we need data. I'm not like, my position is not like I'm against this. Here's what we do in America, whether it's San Francisco or choose any place. We have one policy, and then we eventually, it takes a long time, we confront it with another policy.
right.
I'm against both of those. And I'm like equal opportunity offender, like the far right are now pushing the whole thing of like homelessness is driven by drug addiction. Like you can't deny that they're correlated, but to say drug addiction is the driver of homelessness is a vast oversimplification. It's an extremely complex issue, and it's driven as much by economic conditions as it is by addiction.
But the same thing you could say as the other side of that coin is that they say homelessness is caused by high rent. They say that all the time.
Well, that's not true either. The point is, I think we need to zoom out and realize, okay, like this is what's in common. Like, okay, the last election, nothing brings out unity in Americans like an election year. Like we're so divisive. We're so angry,
Right.
And my kids are a bit younger. We're not on the same page politically, so we try, but we agreed to have difficult conversations to talk about it. Like we don't talk about politics. No, I believe in free speech. Let's talk, let's argue, let's be passionate about, but let's listen. Okay. And they were depressed about the outcome of the election. And I'm like, folks, you've got to go back a little bit. This is nothing new. America has always been divided. In fact, if you want to be hopeful, no one has been caned to death in the Senate floor recently. So we're actually making progress.
Right. Right.
Americans have always been divided. And I think we miss the bigger picture that power transferred peacefully. The American system is a miracle, and our institutions have held out. And I think we need to take that view and now realize we need to iterate upon it. And now we need to all take responsibility and realize there's a machine, a system in place for creating policy that we're all part of and we all participate in, even if you choose not to participate. You're choosing not to participate, you're still a part of the system, okay? And realize our system for making policy is what is broken. So now, rather than replacing one policy with another, which is important, we need to do that, but we need to zoom out and say, what are the tools we have for making policy? And let's acknowledge that those suck. They're not very good, which is why we're getting such negative outcomes. We spend tons of money, but we get negative outcomes.
Right.
We exacerbate the problem. Let's address that and say, how can we create better tools for policymaking?
I would agree with that. I also would agree that the way the people that I think that representative politics, I think it's really important that we have balance within representative politics. And it's like in states that are red states where it's all Republican, for example, in their state houses, you get laws that generally are more conservative, don't necessarily work out for poor people too good, uh, maybe hold people down. And then you have states like California where it's the other way, where you have a super majority, tremendous amounts of wealth, but everything's on the far left, the left and the far left, where you get radicalized policies like this whole assembly bill last week, the last couple of weeks, about whether or not to criminalize the solicitation of sex of minors, 16 and 17 years old, where you actually had a state senator and several state assemblymen actually try to redraw up the bill to not include 16 and 17-year-olds that were solicited for sex as being a felony. And they were saying they were making up some kind of weird reasons about, like, if you were in high school and
They
you
were
offered
not
your
true.
friend $20 to fool around, like, who does that? Like, that's not
Yeah, they chose a fictional case, which is not representative of what's really
that's right.
happening. They did not look at the real data. The real data is most of the buyers are in their 40s plus. Most of the buyers, buying sex costs money, so it's the people that represent that group that have money.
Right.
They're predominantly white, and who they're purchasing are young, they're children. So
Right.
yeah, that's what's happening. And then they
So that's the flip side. But, like, in some red states now, they've restricted SNAP benefits for people that are getting food stamps so that you can't buy chips and soda anymore. So now we're telling people what they can buy, what kind of food they can buy, what they can't buy. And I have very mixed feelings about that. While as
chips and soda, that's a whole different discussion. I
it
actually
is.
think that that might be, well, I think we should definitely start restricting chips. I think the chips and soda, the sugar industry, is similarly culpable to the way the tobacco industry was culpable.
How about we make chips and soda a little more healthy and take all the additives and the fillers out and stop using high fructose corn syrup and use real sugar? I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do instead of just restricting people that would normally, like, look, I've been on food stamps. I have. And my wife's been on food stamps. When I was out in my addiction, she was getting help. We had 2 kids at the time. They were small, 7 and 9, right? And it's like she's she's at the store and my son wants a bag of chips. Now she has to take one, just a bag of Cheetos. She can't do it anymore. She'd have to pull out her own money to buy that. And I don't know if that's the right
Yeah, no,
thing to
you're
do out there.
talking about a systemic issue and you
Yeah.
address just one. The deeper issue is that healthy food does not inherently cost more than bad unhealthy
I,
food.
I think unhealthy food actually costs more than healthy food, to be honest with you. But
But in our system,
right.
the cheapest calories are very unhealthy calories. Sugar, water, soda, sugar, water, and chips, and all that.
I
Because now many people don't know this, like the corn industry is subsidized by the government. So we're paying tax, you look at the cost of diabetes on society. One of the costs is actually taxes because we're subsidizing low fructose, high fructose corn syrup, which is as unhealthy. It does the same thing to your liver as alcohol, which is shown it's extremely harmful for you.
right.
And we make it cheaper by subsidizing it by our taxes.
Right. Well, I guess, we can, the thing is we're having a discussion about this and we can agree to disagree on that issue. And I think I try to look at it more from the ground because I spend so much time on the ground and I've been on the ground. And I'm not saying you haven't because I know you have, but it's just, I think, I think we have to make sure that when we're holding
I'm
people
just being
accountable,
contrarian. I don't necessarily agree or disagree with that specific policy.
I think compassion comes in many forms.
Mhm.
That's what I think. I think if you're a homeless drug addict on the street and you get arrested and get taken to jail to sober out and then get sent to rehab, I think that that's compassion. You know, some people don't see it that way, and the general reasoning behind it is that
What I
we're
don't like
criminalizing.
we then say that's not compassion, and then we cite, like you said, Netherlands.
Right.
We do the exact. You know what they do in the Netherlands? They mandate you go to,
I know.
and they say either go to prison or go to rehab. Those are your choices. And they do it in such a nice, gracious way, and they talk to people. They have an integrated system.
Well, and they have a full continuum of care, which is
Yeah.
what we lack. And this is what makes me so frustrated in San Francisco is that you have these folks that want to open supervised consumption sites without having a continuum of care. So San Francisco has 74 now. They just added like 20. They have 74 detox beds in the whole city. We've got 25,000 drug users in San Francisco, approximately. 74 detox beds in the whole city. That's it. 500, 600 treatment beds in the whole city funded by DPH for 25,000 people. And so even if 10% of them, which is about the average of people that use drugs, want to go to treatment, that's 2,500 people. We don't have the resources for even those people, right? And so what ends up happening is there's a subset of those people underneath that end up on the street. And so right now, in San Francisco, they say there's 8,000 homeless. It's really about 20,000 homeless that are in the city because you got to factor in all the people living in RVs. You go out to Candlestick Point, hundreds of RVs out there, people living in their cars, people couch surfing, people in jail, people in rehab. Those people are all homeless.
Yeah.
Right? Even depending on the definition, people living in SROs in San Francisco are considered homeless, even though they sign a lease, so they're really not homeless. So it's just
many of them are living in the SRO but sleeping on the streets because they want to be closer to their drug dealer.
Well, of course. They don't want to just sit in their room all day because they don't do anything. You got to remember that housing first. Okay, let's talk about housing first for a second. Housing first is for people that it's subsidized housing is what it is. Okay. And in order to qualify, you basically can't make, you can only make like 20 or 30% over the poverty line of income, and then you don't qualify anymore. So basically it's housing for people that are disabled. And then if you become abled again because you've healed or whatever, and you go to work and you make too much money, you can't live there anymore, and you have to move out into market rate housing, which is $2,500 a month for rent, right? So there's actually an incentive for people in permanent supportive housing to stay in permanent supportive housing.
And we see that it's very difficult for them to get out.
Because they're only paying 30% of their gross monthly income to the rent, while the taxpayer in San Francisco is paying $400 million a year to subsidize that rent. Right? For the 16,000 or so that are in permanent supportive housing. And so what happens inside that housing? Well, they say they have voluntary services, voluntary wraparound services available to people. So there's been, I mean, just one building alone that I know of, there were 3 fires that each one caused over $250,000 in damage. 2 of them were started by people that were struggling with meth addiction that had basically they had the electric scooters, and they were tinkering with the batteries, and the batteries caught fire, burned down a whole floor of the apartment building.
What were they tinkering with the battery?
Well, because when you use meth, you get really almost like OCD, and you get focused on stuff.
So they
taking
just
things
took
apart.
a lime scooter and were taking it apart.
Yeah, and started a fire, right? Another building, 13 people overdosed inside the building and died. And you take a step back, and you see that it's 21% of all overdose deaths in San Francisco happen inside permanent supportive housing. That's a data set that they did not reveal. We had to do a Freedom of Information Act request. One of my friends did a request to get that data because they wouldn't make that data public, because that would then feed the narrative that, oh, housing first isn't working, right? And then you think about how much money we spend on this, and it's like, yes, we want to help poor people. Yes, we want to help people be housed and get off the street. But damn it, you need to have those services be compulsory.
And is the data actually showing that what we're doing is helping them? See, when you said, like, okay, here's the narrative. The Republicans aren't helping the poor. They're helping big businesses, and the Democrats are the champions of the poor. And I would say both of them are pursuing the ends of the political donor class. Both of them. I would say this is a statement of fact because it's based upon the data. If you look over the last 3 decades or so, both of them don't care about the poor.
Yeah, they're a tool.
They're a tool to get power and to stay in power.
Correct. I would agree with that.
And our policies are broken, and the poor are the ones who are getting screwed.
Right.
And we go from one policy that screws them to another one that screws them.
But within that subset of people that are in that type of housing that need help, there's a bunch of people that are addicted to drugs.
Oh, absolutely.
That are screwing it up for everyone else.
Yep.
Right? And it's that subset of people that get vehemently defended to the point that we have a 2-tier justice system for them. Where it's like, No, they're victims. You're criminalizing them. We can't hold them accountable. It's like, dude, they just burned down the apartment building. I think that
I think we need to hold, yes, move to responsibility,
right.
like it's not about punishment. It's about better outcomes for them, So I'm loving this conversation. Do you want to wrap up your critique of our current system? And then, in a nutshell, what would be the low-hanging fruit of policy recommendations that we could implement that would improve the system?
Okay, I'll just say this. Harm reduction as a drug policy is failing. Harm reduction is a set of tools. It does not make for good policy. We should be leading with a recovery first policy, which they're trying to do a watered down version of here in San Francisco that I support. Why not? Right? And that should be our national model to recovery. That's why back last year.
Holistic care.
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, that is a much more accurate description of what they do in the countries that succeed,
That's
whatever
correct.
country you prove.
That's right.
We know that it's a continuum of care. It's holistic care. The person needs wraparound services. They need everything. And we have to believe and hope and project. We have to believe in human flourishing for all and help them get into a place where they're independent and sober and living an abundant life.
Agreed. And that's where housing first is also failing because housing first is monolithic. It needs to diversify. If housing first is going to survive, and right now I have serious doubts if it's going to survive because I guarantee you at the federal level, they are getting ready to dismantle it.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting here watching with my popcorn because they had their chance and they screwed up. You basically let these radical leftists get in charge and these radicalized housing activists get in charge. And they created this monolithic one-size-fits-all system where it's super low barrier and people can pretty much do whatever the hell they want inside that housing.
But is it really super low barrier? Okay. We call it super low barrier. Here's how I describe it. Here's how we provide services in the US. We create a clinic at the bottom of a cliff, but we don't actually put it at the bottom of a cliff. We put 200 yards from the bottom of the cliff. People fall off the cliff. If they survive that and they're able to crawl 200 yards, then we'll provide services for them. So we say it's low entry to barrier, but practically it's not because there's these massive waiting lists. And then we focus on those who are the worst, who've been on the waiting list the longest, where metaphorically, going back to it, if you just go up to the top of the cliff and make sure that the barrier where the people are falling off the cliff is there's a guardrail there, you have many, many, many more options than you have if you wait till after they've fallen off the bottom of the cliff. So we invest our money as society to build housing, but we say you're on a waiting list and we'll choose you by the longest you've been on the waiting list. Well, okay, you got to get homeless and, get on the waiting list for housing because then they'll help you. And it's housing first. We want to give housing first. And the waiting list is 7 years.
Right. Well, and
So what's the point?
and then they make exceptions all the time for people based on their acuity of their of how sick they are, how long they've been homeless, and they make exceptions so that people leapfrog the front of the line too and go into housing, which makes the wait list even longer. So my argument is this: is that yes, we need more housing. Of course, we do.
Absolutely.
California, especially, is struggling with affordable housing. We need more affordable housing for people
In every area.
in every area. But how many years is it going to take? Okay, so if you just count not the people that are living on the margins, if we just talk about the people that are currently unsheltered, homeless on the street right now, we're talking about 90,000 people in the state of California. There's 190,000 total that are living.
Supply and demand, we're way behind. It's going to take a long time. And now with tariffs and all that, man, the building costs are going to go through the
Right.
roof.
So it would take a minimum of a decade to build that out. How many of them are going to be dead by then? Why aren't we looking at interim solutions, which only now they're starting to look? I mean, only now, like San Jose is like kind of like one of the only places that's like finally like, okay, we're going to build tiny home cabins and get people housed, even if it's just for a couple of years to just buy us some time, right? They refused to do
Groups
that.
like Dignity Moves,
Yeah.
they're doing it. And these tiny home villages are beautiful.
Yeah, well, the Salvation Army in Silicon
Yeah.
Valley, they basically they're converting their grass lot. They got funding from the county of Santa Clara.
Yeah.
They're going to add 75 of those homes on their lot. Like, great. Like, those are the kinds of solutions we need to be focusing on right now. But The Housing Act, I just want to say this last thing. Housing First people are backed by housing activists that built this whole entire narrative over the years that we need to be compassionate and that everybody deserves homelessness, deserves housing, including drug users, etc. But the the real idea behind it isn't to help people necessarily get better. They just assume that once they're inside, it's going to get better. The real thing is they want them to sign a lease so that they're protected under the Fair Housing Act. Um, that's the difference between the two, because when you sign a lease and you're protected under the Fair Housing Act, you cannot make services compulsory. And so you take someone that has or morbidities and co-occurring disorders that obviously needs treatment, clearly needs treatment, and you have them sign a lease. Now you can't make them do any of that, and you put them inside a hotel room. You call it housing, and they walk in with a gram of fentanyl and their foil and their straw, and you pull them out in a body bag a month later. That's literally what's happening to like 20% of everyone we put into this kind of supportive housing. That's the kind of policy that has to change, and I'm going to fight until the end to make sure that that policy changes in California.
Well, I think you have a advocate with Daniel Laurie. He's confronting that too. That's what he ran on.
Yeah, I mean, at least he's pragmatic. He's willing to.
That's what we want to be pragmatic, and we need to learn. We need to look at the data. I don't care what you say your policy is about. Okay, what are the ideals of your policy? I'm all for that. Okay, now show me the evidence that that's what it's actually coming through, because the pro-housing advocates are going to argue and they're going to cite all their cases. Okay, actually show me the data of what's actually happening. And the scenario that you described is far too real, and the data is showing that that's the outcome that's happening.
It's worthy to point out, and that data again is being obfuscated. They're blocking that data from being made public, except for by a few people like me and Gina McDonald and Steve Adami and people that have to do Freedom of Information Act requests to actually get the data.
So we need more advocates. That's why I'm a big champion of Edge and Node and Geo, and they're a bunch of young, smart Web3 guys trying to solve these problems. That's to me what actually makes me optimistic, is that yes, we have these horrible policies, but like in recovery, or I didn't go through the journey yourself, but we've all had significant changes we've made in our lives for the better. It generally had to get worse before it got better. And you had to hit a point where it was bad enough that you're willing to take the action that's necessary. I believe San Francisco is at that place. I'm very hopeful, and I think the problem, that is the silver lining behind it. The other thing that makes me hopeful is the opportunity, the tools, and just we're ready for change. Change is happening.
Right.
It's like everything is loose. Everything that was stuck in place is all loosened up already. So now get involved and let's build the future that we want.
One of the big signals of that change happening statewide was in November when the voters passed Prop 36, which was to increase penalties for fentanyl dealers, to increase penalties for repeat offending people that steal and shoplift, to roll back aspects of Prop 47, which decriminalized and reduced penalties for a lot of things. It passed with 69% of the vote, right? That's a mandate from the people. People want change. People want to feel safe in their communities. People want accountability. And yes, we're compassionate, and we want homelessness to end, and we don't want to criminalize homelessness. It's
a hopeful note. You had mentioned, it's SB something. 347. Do you remember the number of the human trafficking bill?
I think it's AB 347.
Yeah, AB 347. AB 347, and it was SB 1414 that passed prior.
Yeah,
they'd actually, in a backdoor deal, gutted. That one was supposed to provide protections for minors from human trafficking. They had gutted that and taken out the protections of 16 and 17-year-olds. So AB 347 came out. corrected some other issues, and then was going to also provide those same protections to 16 and 17-year-olds. In other words, every other state in our union, it's a felony to purchase sex with a minor. Not so in California.
And then what's coming next after that?
Well, I was trying to lead on a hopeful note. Regardless of whether they can be held accountable or not, whatever, the activists won that victory. It was a
They did.
victory. They got their bill passed. They got the protection for the 16 and 17-year-olds.
They did.
They resurrected this woman's career who they tried to crucify. They relisted her on the list. I actually think that they're not invulnerable. I think they still have to get the votes. And I think if there's people who want to make a change, it starts with us. It starts with, politics are downstream of culture. And that's why we can't really point the finger. And I think, yes, nationwide we have a balance. We go right and left. I don't think the balance is as healthy as it should be because we go so far. I actually think if we'll accept it, and I'm a registered Republican, full disclosure. I'm a very strong critic of the Republican Party in California. If you want to make change, if you don't like the direction America is going, now's your chance to get involved and make the change, be the change.
But I would say the same thing for California. So it's not San Francisco is already turning a corner. It's California now that needs to turn a corner. They need to embrace things like Prop 36. They need to embrace things like Recovery First. They need to embrace things like drug-free recovery housing, pragmatic ideas that promote people to get healthy, right? And away from the social detriments of health that not only cause death, but create chaos in your community because of the drug use, right? That's what we need to strive for. And so that's the message of hope that I try to bring to people in California.
Well, keep up the good work. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your time of listening to us. And let's go change the world.
Okay, let's go.
All right. God bless.
All right. Thanks, Ted.